When you think of freedom, whose face do you see? A statue in bronze, a courtroom defiant, a man in a cell staring through iron bars at a sky he refused to surrender. Tonight on Faces of History, we walk the long road to freedom, brick by brick, heartbreak by heartbreak, beside a boy born in the rolling hills of the Transkei, who became a lawyer, a fugitive, a prisoner, and then, impossibly, the president of a country that once called him a terrorist. This is the story of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the man who taught the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Before the Nobel Prize, before the prison cell, before the bulletproof motorcade and the cheering crowds, Nelson Mandela was just a boy with dust on his feet and cattle to watch. His birth name was Rolihlahla, a Xhosa word meaning pulling the branch of a tree. Some say it means troublemaker. Maybe it was fate naming him that. He was born on July 18th, 1918, in the tiny village of Mvezo on the banks of the Mbashe River in the Transkei region, a place of rolling green hills and wide skies on South Africa's southeastern tip. Back then, the Union of South Africa was just 8 years old, stitched together by the British Empire after decades of war and colonization. To the empire, the Transkei was just a Bantustan, a native reserve. To Mandela, it was a kingdom of grass and goats, stories and songs. His father, Gadla Henry Mafakaniswa, was a chief of the Thembu people, respected, stubborn, a counselor to kings. He had 4 wives and 13 children, each part of a complicated Xhosa household that measured wealth not in money but in cattle, land, and family ties. Mandela's mother, Nosekeni Fanny, was Gadla's 3rd wife, strong, patient, deeply devout. She raised Rolihlahla with stories of Thembu ancestors, heroes and chiefs who'd resisted British conquest. From her, he learned humility and faith. From his father, he inherited defiance. When Mandela was about 9 years old, his father stood up to a local magistrate and lost his land and title for it. The family had to move to Kunu, another small village nearby. That move shaped young Rolihlahla's life more than anyone knew then. In Kunu, he was just one of the boys, barefoot, laughing in the fields, stick fighting with his friends, rolling in the dust, chasing calves through the thorn bushes. School was a single-room hut. The chalk squeaked, the teacher's cane cracked on desks, and one day that teacher gave him a new name, Nelson, a neat British name for the empire's school registers. Rolihlahla never chose it, but he carried it for the rest of his life. When Gadla died, the young boy's path changed again. His mother took him on a day-long journey by foot to Minghekezweni, the royal seat of the Thembu people. There, under the roof of Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo, the acting regent of the Thembu nation, Mandela found a new father figure, strict but fair, determined to mold him into a counselor, a chief, a leader in the old traditions. Minghekezweni was more than a home. It was Mandela's first taste of politics. By day, he played in the fields, herded cattle, and sat cross-legged with other boys, listening to elders settle disputes under the shade of a big tree. He watched as villagers brought their quarrels, land, cattle, marriage, honor, and watched how Jongintaba listened to every voice before deciding. It taught Mandela something no prison cell could later take away, that leadership is not the shout of one man, but the chorus of many. In the evenings, Jongintaba would summon the young boys into his hut. There, fires crackled, elders smoked pipes, and ancient stories poured out. Battles fought against British invaders, heroes who resisted the white settlers who seized their cattle, their chiefs, their land. These were not fairy tales. They were lessons in dignity and duty. Outside, the empire's world was closing in, past laws, taxes, forced labor. But in Minghekezweni, Mandela learned to stand tall. Even then, there was a quiet steel in him, the herdsboy who dreamed not of war or gold, but of honor, service, and freedom, even if he didn't yet know the shape it would take. Before he became a prisoner, a rebel, or a president, Nelson Mandela was just a boy, barefoot in the veld, stick in hand, eyes on the cattle, ears full of stories of how a man should live and what he must never kneel to. From the green hills of Minghekezweni, the boy named Rolihlahla, now Nelson, was no longer just a herdsboy chasing cattle through the grass. He was on a path laid by his guardian, Chief Jongintaba, a path meant to make him a counselor, a bridge between the Thembu and the colonial rulers, tightening their grip on South Africa. The first stop on that path was Clarkberry Boarding Institute, a Methodist school for black boys, one of the best of its time, yet still a place built to turn African children into obedient clerks and servants for the white colonial system. Mandela arrived at 16, shy but determined. He wore trousers and boots for the first time. The teachers, mostly stern missionaries, drilled him in scripture, English, and British manners. He learned Latin phrases and the Bible side by side. He was bright, sharper than most. But what set him apart wasn't grades alone. It was his hunger for more. He read the speeches of Lincoln and Shakespeare, Greek tragedies, and missionary sermons. He watched the older boys test the rules and began to feel that quiet ember of defiance flare up again. Next came Hilltown, another Methodist institution, perched on a windy hill near Fort Beaufort. Here, Mandela found himself among the sons of chiefs and headmen from all across the Transkei, the next generation who would either bend to the white state or find a way to resist it. At Hilltown, Mandela began to see his world for what it really was, a place where black boys like him were taught just enough to serve, but never enough to lead. The curriculum gave him Shakespeare and hymns, but outside the classroom, the empire's iron rules pressed down harder each year. Past books, segregation, poverty. He saw older students expelled for defying the principal's petty decrees. He learned how to stand his ground, softly at first, but firmer every year. Then came Fort Hare. Fort Hare was the crown jewel of black education in South Africa, the only university for black Africans, a place where young men could dream of becoming lawyers, doctors, teachers, the black elite that the British hoped would help run their empire peacefully. Mandela arrived at Fort Hare in 1939. For the first time, he mixed with Africans from all over southern Africa: Zulu, Sotho, Tswana, Xhosa. It opened his mind. He joined debates, listened to political arguments, soaked up radical newspapers smuggled in from the cities. The world beyond the hills came alive. Gandhi's nonviolent resistance in India, the labor strikes in Johannesburg, whispers of socialism and black consciousness. He was shy at first, content to watch. But when the students pushed back against the university's rigid rules, bad food, petty fines, harsh discipline, Mandela found himself pulled in. He joined a boycott of the Student Representative Council election. It was a small rebellion, just a stand over student autonomy, but it cost him dearly. Jongintaba, the guardian who'd raised him like a son, summoned Mandela home in fury. He told him that he'd arranged a marriage for him, a respectable match to bind him closer to royal duty and tradition. It was supposed to tame him, root him in family and clan. But Mandela, barely 22, wasn't ready to be tamed. Johannesburg in the 1940s was a city of gold and ghosts. Black men toiled in deep shafts that clawed at the earth for gold that filled the pockets of white mine owners. Past laws turned every black man into a suspect, every street a possible jail. Shantytowns stretched for miles. Alexandra, Sophiatown, Orlando, makeshift worlds of jazz clubs, shebeens, dusty streets, and burning ideas. Mandela found work as a mine night watchman, a guard with a whistle and baton, paid next to nothing. But a chance encounter, fate again, that old trickster, brought him to Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent and quiet political force. Sisulu saw something in the skinny, serious young man from the Transkei. Through Sisulu, Mandela found his first real job as an articled clerk at a white law firm run by Lazar Sadelsky, a Jewish lawyer who saw the injustice of apartheid clearly. By day, Mandela fetched papers and delivered files, learning the craft of the law one letter at a time. By night, he studied by candlelight for his degree, the first step to something bigger. It was Sisulu who introduced Mandela to the African National Congress, the ANC, an organization that had been fighting for the rights of black South Africans since 1912, mostly with polite petitions, polite protests, polite letters to London. But a new generation, young men like Mandela, Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Anton Lembede, thought politeness alone would never break the chains tightening around their people's necks. They formed the ANC Youth League, hungry for direct action, strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience. They believed the time for bowing and asking nicely was over. South Africa was changing, growing colder, harsher, more brazenly racist by the day, and so must they. In the flickering lamplight of rented rooms, in the whispered debates over tea in Sophia Town, Nelson Mandela, the herdsboy from Kunu, was reborn as a rebel. He still dressed sharply, still carried himself like a country gentleman, but behind the tie and briefcase was a mind sharpening into a weapon. He had found his purpose and a cause worth fighting for. Johannesburg in the 1940s was a city of bright lights and deep shadows, a place where black ambition collided head-on with white fear. For Nelson Mandela, it became the furnace that forged a lawyer, a leader, and soon enough, an enemy of the state. By day, Mandela worked at the law firm, first as a clerk, then side by side with Oliver Tambo in what would become South Africa's first black law partnership. They called it Mandela and Tambo Attorneys, a cramped office in Chancellor House with battered furniture, overcrowded filing cabinets, and a waiting room that overflowed daily with black South Africans desperate for help. Their clients were domestic workers dismissed without wages, families facing forced eviction, minors beaten and cheated by bosses, mothers whose husbands had vanished into the depths of the gold mines. The courts were stacked against them, white judges, white prosecutors, white laws. But Mandela learned to wield the law like a shield, sometimes a sword. He fought to buy time, to expose injustice, to stall the bulldozers and the police vans. Outside the courtroom, he fought too. With Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and other young radicals in the ANC Youth League, Mandela helped drag the old ANC into the age of mass resistance. The polite petitions of the elders gave way to the roar of the streets. The Youth League wrote its founding manifesto in 1944, its message simple and urgent: Africa for Africans. They rejected subservience. They demanded dignity, freedom, equal rights, African leadership of African lives. Mandela, once shy, once cautious, learned the fire of speeches, the precision of strategy. His Xhosa upbringing taught him how to listen. The Youth League taught him how to lead. Then came 1948, and the darkness deepened. That year, the National Party won South Africa's election, an all-white electorate choosing white supremacy, wrapped in a new word that would stain the century: apartheid. Apartheid was more than segregation. It was a grand design to turn black South Africans into perpetual foreigners in their own land. Laws multiplied overnight. Passed laws, prohibitions on interracial marriage, job reservations, racially zoned neighborhoods. The cities were carved up like butchered meat, clean white suburbs here, sprawling black townships over there. In this new reality, the ANC Youth League knew petitions would get them nowhere. So they launched the Defiance Campaign, the largest organized act of civil disobedience South Africa had ever seen. In 1952, thousands of volunteers, black, Indian, and colored South Africans, deliberately broke unjust laws. They sat on whites-only benches, walked through whites-only doors, rode whites-only buses. Police arrested them in droves, just as planned. Mandela was at the center of it all. Not just marching in the streets, but organizing bail money, coordinating volunteers, smuggling messages when the police tried to break up protests. He was arrested, banned, rearrested. His passport was taken away. He was banned from gatherings of more than 2 people. But the harder the government squeezed, the wider the movement spread. In 1955, the ANC and its allies, trade unions, Indian Congress, Communist Party, gathered in a dusty field outside Johannesburg and adopted the Freedom Charter. It was a bold, defiant vision. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It called for equality, land reform, fair wages, free education, an end to the past laws. The state responded as it always did, with arrests. In 1956, Mandela and 155 others were rounded up and charged with high treason. The trial dragged on for 5 years. By the time it ended in acquittal, the government had achieved its goal anyway: to tie up the leaders in endless court battles and drain the movement's strength. Young people saw in him not just a lawyer, but a symbol of courage. Older leaders saw in him a link between the polite old guard and the angry new generation. His personal life, meanwhile, grew as turbulent as the streets. He married Evelyn Mace, a nurse, in 1944. They had 4 children together. But the marriage buckled under the weight of Mandela's constant absences, late-night meetings, sudden arrests, and the endless strain of the struggle. They divorced in 1958. That same year, Mandela married Winnie Madikizela, a social worker 16 years his junior. Winnie was no quiet housewife. She would become a fighter in her own right, fearless and unbending, enduring her own jail cells, banishment, and police harassment while Mandela sat in prison for decades. By the end of the 1950s, Mandela, the once polite law student, had become an enemy of the apartheid state. His phone was tapped, his mail was read, his movements were watched, but he refused to run. He was the spear at the tip of a growing army of teachers, workers, miners, students, all tired of crawling under the boots of men who called themselves masters. When peaceful protest failed, he would choose a new path, a darker one. Mandela would soon become the Black Pimpernel, the underground freedom fighter, the man who traded law books for sabotage manuals and trial briefs for secret safe houses. But that part of his story, too, would come at a terrible cost. By the dawn of the 1960s, Nelson Mandela was already living on borrowed freedom, a man out of place in his own country, watched by police, banned from gatherings, forced to meet comrades in secret. For more than a decade, he and the African National Congress had fought apartheid with boycotts, strikes, and moral courage. But in 1960, that strategy was blown apart by bullets and blood in a dusty township called Sharpeville. It was March 21st, 1960, a Monday. In Sharpeville, outside Johannesburg, thousands of black men and women gathered outside a police station to protest the hated pass laws. The hated little books every black South African had to carry, dictating where they could live, work, or walk. No pass, jail. Fines, beatings. Generations were caged by ink and paper. That morning, the crowd was peaceful, unarmed. Families, students, workers, some barefoot, some in Sunday clothes. They wanted to be arrested, to flood the jails, to show the world how rotten the system was. Police panicked. A line of white officers, rifles raised, nerves frayed by years of fear and prejudice, then a shot cracked the tense air, and then another. When the echo cleared, 69 people lay dead, many shot in the back as they fled, over 180 wounded, blood pooling on dusty earth. Sharpeville was Mandela's breaking point. He and the ANC had preached nonviolence for decades, inspired by Gandhi's marches in India, by King's protests in America. But now he looked at the bullet-riddled bodies, the tearful families, the cold arrogance of the state, and he realized petitions and peaceful defiance would never bring down a government willing to gun down children in broad daylight. Mandela and his closest comrades began to debate. Was it time to fight fire with fire? He disappeared underground, shaving his beard, wearing workman's overalls, slipping from safe house to safe house in the townships. The press called him the Black Pimpernel, always seen, never caught. He gave secret speeches at night, urging the people not to abandon hope, but to change tactics. In 1961, Mandela helped form the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, or MK for short. For Mandela, it was not an easy choice, but a necessary one. They would not become terrorists who bombed children in churches. They would strike at symbols of the state, power stations, telephone lines, military outposts. Sabotage, not murder. Disruption, not massacre. Mandela traveled the continent in secret, seeking in training and funds. He slipped out of South Africa disguised as a chauffeur, driving across the Bechuanaland Protectorate, Tanganyika, Ethiopia. In Addis Ababa, he trained in sabotage, learned to shoot, to make bombs. He met African leaders who had won their own freedom, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Ethiopia's Haile Selassie, and drew strength from the rising wave of independence sweeping Africa. But back home, the noose was tightening. The apartheid regime was ruthless. Spies in the townships, secret police in plain clothes. They tapped phones, bribed neighbors, broke families. One by one, Umkhonto safe houses fell. On August 5, 1962, Mandela's luck ran out. After 17 months on the run, he was driving near Howick, KwaZulu-Natal, when police flagged him down. Some say the CIA tipped them off. Others whisper about betrayal. Mandela was arrested, disguised as a chauffeur, but the state knew exactly who sat behind that wheel. He was charged first for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years. But while Mandela sat behind bars at Pretoria Central Prison, police raided a farm outside Johannesburg, Liliesleaf Farm, the secret headquarters of the ANC's armed wing. There, they found documents, sabotage plans, bomb-making manuals, undeniable evidence. They brought Mandela from his small cell back to court, this time not for protest, but for sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. The maximum penalty, death by hanging. The Rivonia trial, named for the suburb where the farm stood, became Mandela's crucible, his line in the sand. For months, he and his co-accused, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, and others, stood in the dock facing white judges, white prosecutors, and a white government eager to silence them forever. Mandela's lawyer urged him to plead for mercy. Instead, Mandela decided to speak for himself. His statement from the dock lasted 4 hours, a calm, relentless dismantling of the apartheid lie. He confessed that he and his comrades had turned to sabotage, but not terror, because all peaceful roads had been blocked by violence from the state. And then came the words that would echo through iron bars across continents down the corridors of history. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The court fell silent. The judge, a conservative Afrikaner, did not hang Mandela that day. Perhaps he feared creating a martyr. Perhaps he hoped prison would do what the bullet could not, break the man's spirit. On June 12, 1964, Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life in prison. Mandela smiled as the verdict was read. To him, prison was not defeat. It was another battlefield. The herdsboy from Kunu, the rebel lawyer, the secret saboteur, now became prisoner 466-64. But the story did not end behind bars. It was only the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that would last 27 long, unbroken years. When the judge's gavel fell in 1964 and the sentence was read, life imprisonment, many in the courtroom thought they'd seen the last of Nelson Mandela, that this upstart lawyer from the Transkei, this black pimpernel who slipped through their fingers too long, would finally vanish behind high walls and iron bars until time forgot him. But instead, they made him a legend. Mandela's new home was Robben Island, a flat, wind-swept rock off the coast of Cape Town. For centuries, it had been a place of banishment, first for lepers and the mentally ill, now for South Africa's most dangerous idea, freedom. The journey from court to cell was meant to break him, and in small ways, it did. They shaved his head. They gave him prison clothes, shorts, no trousers. A small, humiliating detail meant to remind him that, to the apartheid state, even grown black men were children to be disciplined. His cell was barely 7 feet by 7 feet, a mat on the floor, a thin blanket, a metal bucket for a toilet, a barred window high enough that even on tiptoes, he could only see a sliver of sky. By day, the prisoners labored. They were marched under armed guard to the lime quarry, an endless glare of white rock and sun that burned their eyes and blistered their backs. Mandela and his comrades dug and broke stones with pickaxes, choking on the dust. The glare damaged his eyes permanently. For the rest of his life, he'd be sensitive to camera flashes, a small, physical reminder of years under that punishing sun. At night, they returned to their cells, exhausted, hungry, humiliated. Letters were censored, visits were rare. Prison warders mocked them, isolated them, tried to pit them against each other. They called Mandela troublemaker. Rolilala indeed. Yet inside that island prison, Mandela grew into something even stronger than the rebel he'd been outside. He read, he studied, he debated, he learned Afrikaans so he could understand the mind of his jailers and break it open. He turned the prison into what some called the Robben Island University. He and Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, they taught young prisoners politics, philosophy, Xhosa history. They staged debates through cell bars, smuggled in books, passed secret notes hidden in empty matchboxes. In the yard, they walked in slow circles, rehearsing arguments about Marx, the ANC, the future that waited for them beyond the surf. Mandela refused special treatment. When offered freedom in exchange for renouncing violence, he said no. Only free men can negotiate, he told the government emissaries. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts. He knew the regime wanted him to break. Instead, he learned to bend. In small ways, he won. He and his comrades demanded trousers for African prisoners. They got them. They demanded study rights, better food, respect for religious practice. Each victory, tiny as it was, chipped away at the illusion that the jailers held all the power. Outside, the world began to change, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a roar. The Soweto Uprising of 1976, schoolchildren shot down for demanding to learn in their own language. The killing of Steve Biko, the black consciousness leader beaten to death in police custody. The world saw the apartheid state for what it was, a frightened giant clutching guns and paper laws. Mandela's name became a rallying cry in faraway cities. Posters in London, New York, Lagos, Free Nelson Mandela. Musicians sang about him. Students marched for him. Sanctions tightened around the white minority government like a noose they couldn't slip. Yet for the man himself, the days crawled. Prison life was a rhythm of hope and despair. He missed watching his children grow up. His mother died. His eldest son was killed in a car accident. Mandela learned of these losses through cold letters or in brief, tense visits under a warden's watchful eye. Still, he endured. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, he wrote later, but the triumph over it. Robben Island didn't make him superhuman. It made him more human. The guards changed, too. Some came to respect him, almost against their will. They saw his dignity, his discipline, his refusal to hate even the men who locked the cell behind him each night. After 18 years on Robben Island, he was moved, first to Pollsmoor Prison, then to Victor Verster, closer to Cape Town. There he had a tiny cottage, a bit more freedom, a calculated gesture by a government beginning to understand that the world wouldn't let them keep him forever. Outside, the country was burning. The 1980s brought township uprisings, new boycotts, international sports bans, South Africa's currency collapsing under the weight of global disgust. Mandela, still behind bars, began secret talks with the government he had once sworn to overthrow. He knew apartheid was dying, but how it died and what rose from its ashes would depend on whether he could keep the violence from consuming the dream he'd given his life to. He spoke with generals, presidents, spies, all from the same people who had once hoped he'd die in a dark cell. He did it not to surrender, but to build a bridge wide enough to carry a country across its own fear. And then, on February 11th, 1990, the world saw what South Africa had not seen in 27 years. Nelson Mandela, taller than the myths, walking hand in hand with Winnie through the prison gates, gray hair, clenched fist, calm eyes, the prisoner reborn as a president in waiting. The bars hadn't broken him. They had sharpened him into a statesman. But freedom, Mandela knew, was not the end. It was just another battlefield. When Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on February 11, 1990, hand in hand with Winnie, the world saw more than just a free man. They saw a symbol stepping into sunlight, a man who had entered prison, an outlaw, and emerged a statesman. But the freedom of one man did not yet mean freedom for a nation. If anything, South Africa was now on the edge of a knife. The 1990s dawned with a fragile promise. The iron-fisted apartheid regime was crumbling under boycotts, sanctions, uprisings, and an economy on its knees. F.W. de Klerk, the last white president of South Africa, knew the old order couldn't survive another decade. He legalized the ANC, unbanned political parties, freed Mandela, not as a gift, but as a gamble. Could the prisoner calm the storm, or would his release unleash a civil war? For Mandela, there was no time to savor freedom. In the first days, reporters shoved microphones in his face. Some wanted an apology for the bombings. Some wanted him to promise revenge. Others expected miracles overnight. Mandela gave none of them what they wanted, except the truth. He called for peace, but he didn't promise to forget. He called for democracy, but not a democracy built on surrender. He called for forgiveness, but not amnesia. He urged the world to see white South Africans not as enemies to be crushed, but as citizens to be persuaded that freedom was good for everyone, even for those who'd once lived behind high walls and electric fences. Negotiating the impossible. The years between 1990 and 1994 were some of the bloodiest in South Africa's history. Apartheid's hardliners stoked violence between black communities, Zulu and Xhosa, Inkatha and ANC. Police turned a blind eye or quietly fanned the flames. Bombs went off in crowded streets. Assassins lurked at bus stops and taxi ranks. The dream of a peaceful transition sometimes looked naive, even suicidal. Mandela buried friends. Chris Hani, a popular ANC leader, gunned down by a right-wing extremist in 1993. That death nearly tipped the country into civil war. But Mandela, the prisoner who could not be broken, stood before a grieving, furious nation and steadied it with his words. Tonight, I am reaching out to every South African, black and white, from the very depths of my being. Now is the time for all South Africans to stand together against those who, from any quarter, wish to destroy our future. It took 4 tense years of negotiations, secret and public, bitter and cautious, to get to the ballot box. On April 27, 1994, millions of South Africans queued for hours to vote for the first time in their lives. Old men who'd never held a ballot paper, women who'd marched, beaten, and jailed for this very moment. Children perched on shoulders, watching their parents cast a vote that would change the world. When the ballots were counted, it was clear. Nelson Mandela, prisoner 466-64, was now President Nelson Mandela, the first black president of South Africa, elected by the people he'd spent his life serving. The task before him was unlike anything any leader had ever faced. Mandela did not inherit a country. He inherited one rich, powerful, mostly white, the other poor, dispossessed, and black. Generations of hate, fear, and lies lay between them. He could have called for revenge. Many expected him to. But instead, Mandela chose a different weapon: reconciliation. He invited his jailers to his inauguration. He donned the green jersey of the Springboks, the all-white rugby team hated by black South Africans as a symbol of Afrikaner pride, and stood before thousands at the 1995 Rugby World Cup, urging black fans to cheer for the team that had once shut them out. When the Springboks won, Mandela, in that green number 6 jersey, handed the trophy to Captain Francois Pienaar. It was theater, yes, but it was also healing, a gesture powerful enough to slip past decades of bitterness, if only for a moment. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mandela knew real peace needed more than symbols. South Africa's wounds ran too deep. Apartheid had stolen land, crushed families, murdered dissidents, tortured children. Vengeance would be easy. Justice, true justice, would be harder. So he backed Archbishop Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It called victims and perpetrators into the same rooms. Police generals confessed murders in front of mothers whose sons they'd killed. Torturers revealed secret burial sites. In exchange for full confessions, many were granted amnesty, a bitter pill for some, but a chance for the country to learn its own truth in the open, not in shadows. A leader who knew when to leave. Mandela served just one term as president, by choice. He knew that a leader must not become a king. He stepped down in 1999, handing over to his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. He left a fragile democracy, unequal, scarred, struggling, but free. Mandela spent his last years as the world's elder statesman, a moral compass when so many others had broken theirs. He spoke for the poor, the sick, the forgotten. He took up the fight against HIV/AIDS when his own ANC hesitated. He urged the rich world to cancel Africa's debts. He joked with presidents and pop stars, danced in front of crowds, and scolded the powerful when they failed to live up to their promises. He was not perfect. He knew that better than anyone. He'd failed in his marriages. He'd trusted some comrades too blindly. He watched his beloved ANC sink into corruption and complacency in later years. But he never claimed to be a saint, only a man who'd done what he could with the time given to him. In December 2013, after a long illness, Nelson Mandela died at age 95, in his own bed, surrounded by family, in a country that was free because he had refused to die in prison. South Africans wept. The world lowered its flags, and yet they also sang, in townships and stadiums, the same freedom songs that once rang through dusty church halls and prison yards. Because Mandela had not just given them a country, he'd given them a way to believe in themselves. He showed the world that courage can live behind bars, that peace can be built by men who once chose sabotage, that forgiveness is not weakness, it is the only force stronger than hate. When the sun finally set on Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela's life on December 5, 2013, the world did not pause in silence. Instead, it seemed to exhale in a chorus of voices, 1 billion people whispering the same name, grateful and grieving all at once. He was 95 years old, an old man in a warm bed surrounded by family, his body weakened by age and illness, but his story still standing tall enough to hold up a nation. The world came to say farewell. For 10 days, South Africa became a place of songs and tears. In Soweto's FNB Stadium, tens of thousands gathered in the pouring rain to remember the prisoner who became a president. Presidents, kings, revolutionaries, and ordinary people stood shoulder to shoulder, an impossible audience that only Mandela could unite. Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, took the stage and spoke of how Mandela's courage had given him the courage to dream of his own election. Old foes and friends alike, from George W. Bush to Raul Castro, shook hands under the same roof, a testament to a man who spent his life turning enemies into uneasy partners. Outside the stadium, children sang freedom songs under plastic tarps. Old men in threadbare coats hummed struggle songs they had once whispered under their breath when the police were listening. For once, South Africa's skies poured rain, not in sorrow but in tribute. The Xhosa say rain on a funeral is the ancestors weeping with you. Then his body began its final journey. From the Union buildings in Pretoria, where Mandela had once stood in the same spot, thousands filed past his casket. Some carried flowers, some bowed, others just stood frozen, drinking in the moment. A last chance to look upon the man who had refused to bend to prison walls and white supremacy. In cars and buses, they followed him south, past the mine dumps of Johannesburg, through the Eastern Cape's rolling green hills, back to the red earth of the Transkei, where it had all begun, home to Kunu. At last, Mandela came home to Kunu, the village where he had once chased calves barefoot through the grass, where his mother had walked him to school, where the boy named Rolihlala, troublemaker, learned to herd cattle under a sky too big for any fence. In the final hours, family and friends gathered under canvas tents as elders in beaded headdresses recited prayers in Xhosa, a grave on a gentle hill. Mandela was buried with a simple headstone beside the graves of his parents and children. No marble palace, no towering mausoleum, no cold statue to trap him forever in bronze. The man who could have ruled for life chose instead to return to the same earth that made him. His grave overlooks the rolling plains of the Eastern Cape. On clear mornings, the sun catches the grass just so, and the wind sighs through the aloes and thorn trees. In that quiet place, a nation's most restless soul found peace at last. But Mandela never truly left. His face still smiles from murals on township walls, gray hair, calm eyes, fist raised. His words are still quoted in classrooms, protests, parliaments. His life remains proof that one man, one stubborn, flawed, fiercely human man, can face down an empire armed only with faith in his people and the stubborn belief that freedom is worth the cost. When the world said goodbye, they did not bury a saint. They laid to rest a man who once herded cattle, who once plotted sabotage, who forgave his jailers, who danced at stadiums, who held babies and scolded presidents and laughed at himself. A man who left behind a road unfinished and dared us all to keep walking it. After climbing a great hill, Mandela once wrote, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. South Africa still climbs those hills, inequality, corruption, poverty, but it does so on the shoulders of a man who never claimed the journey would be easy, only that it was necessary. I'm the Duke of New York. This was Faces of History, the story of Nelson Mandela. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, sometimes freedom is not given. Sometimes it is taken day by day, word by word, hill by hill, by people who refuse to forget how far they've come.